Alright, so today I want to introduce you to the Leopard Ivory ball python. It's a pretty interesting combination of genes. The Ivory is actually the super yellow belly with two copies of the yellow belly. It is a standalone gene. The yellow belly looks pretty much like a normal, but if you actually breed two of them together, 25% of the time you get the Ivory. And the Ivory is an all-white snake. It's really visually dominant and masks all the other genes in the Ivory. And the only gene that really breaks through the Ivory is the Leopard. Kind of an interesting effect. There's other genes that break through just a little bit. Sometimes you can see them, but I'd say pretty much the number one gene breaking through the Ivory is the Leopard. So today I want to jump over the internet and I want to show you the potential of the Leopard Ivory ball python. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here at Morphmarket.com and I want to start with just one copy of the yellow belly. The yellow belly is pretty interesting. I consider it kind of a sleeper gene. Just by itself it looks almost like a normal. I actually pulled this one up here. As a matter of fact, this one looks pretty much exactly like a normal. Sometimes they're really hard to tell apart. Sometimes the yellow bellies will actually have a little bit of flaming coming up between kind of these alien heads you hear. You really can't see much flaming at all here. And sometimes they kind of have a little bit of a faded out head. You really can't see it on this one. But if you actually flip them over and look at the belly, a lot of times on either side of the belly on the yellow bellies, you'll actually have kind of a busy pattern, almost like some checkering or some busy pattern on either side of the belly. Pretty much a dead giveaway that you have a yellow belly. So if you actually take two yellow bellies and breed them together, 25% of the time this is what you get. You get an Ivory, kind of an interesting snake. And this is one of the snakes that a lot of times it's not completely white. Sometimes you'll get a little bit of maybe like a dirty color on the side of the snake, and sometimes they can be really clean like this one. Most of the yellow bellies, I'd say, have some kind of a pattern on the head. Sometimes it's kind of grayed out. Sometimes you'll see, like in this one, maybe just a little bit of a lavender color, a little bit of yellow, and a lot of times they'll actually have this faint yellow stripe right down the top of the snake, but some of them are completely white with no pattern at all. It's pretty interesting. And if you actually take Leopard and work it into Ivory, it has an interesting effect. This is what the Leopard looks like. And the Leopard is considered to be a dark gene, and it's kind of interesting. You can actually take the Leopard and work it into a whole bunch of other white snakes, and it really doesn't break through any of the other white snakes. I've actually looked at some Leopard blue-eyed leucistics that are completely white. I've actually seen a Leopard high white pied that is completely white. A lot of times you can actually work, other genes into the pied to get the all-white pied. If you actually work Leopard into the all-white pied, you don't get any effect at all. But if you actually work it into the Ivory, take a look at this. You get a pretty interesting effect. Take a look at that. That is pretty amazing. And kind of the cool thing about the Leopard is when you actually work it into the Ivory, it also brings out not only the Leopard, but other genes along with the Leopard. So sometimes you can have multiple genes in there, and then you add Leopard, and then it kind of brings out all the other genes. You can kind of try to figure out what you actually have in there. Sometimes the results can be kind of unexpected as far as what you'd normally see. This one looks really jumbled up as far as the pattern. It doesn't really doesn't even really look like your typical Leopard. It has all these round spots all over the snake. Doesn't really have the line right down the top. And take a look at the head. It really brings up a lot of the color and the pattern pretty much on the whole snake from head to tail. So here is the Enchi, and the Enchi is kind of interesting. In some combinations, if you work Enchi with other genes in the Ivory, it'll actually bring out a little bit of the color and the pattern of the Enchi and the other genes along with it. I'd say it's a lot less apparent working Enchi into an Ivory compared to the Leopard. And the Enchi, essentially what the Enchi does is it really reduces the pattern. Sometimes you can get different lines of Enchi. Sometimes it really reduces the pattern almost into bands like this, and sometimes you can have just a little bit of an effect from the Enchi. And the Enchi also brings out a lot of your oranges, kind of a yellowish orange color in a lot of your combinations. So take a look at this. If you actually take an Enchi and work it into the Ivory, you essentially end up with, a lot of times, essentially what you end up with is an all-white snake. It looks almost exactly like the Ivory. And sometimes you can actually pick out little bits of color coming in here and there from the Enchi. Sometimes it's pretty apparent. On this one, it's hardly any effect at all. But take a look at what happens happens when you actually add leopard to the Enchy Ivory to try to bring out the Enchy. Take a look at this. It is pretty amazing when you work Enchy in with the leopard and the ivory. And essentially what's happening is the leopard's bringing out a lot of the color and pattern from the ivory, and it's also bringing along with it the color from the Enchy. You can see the really bright color, and it's kind of interesting in this combination that you really don't see much of an Enchy pattern in the combination, but you can definitely tell the Enchy's in there from the color from the leopard bringing a lot of the yellows from the Enchy through the snake. It's pretty amazing what the leopard does to the combinations. So take a look at this. This is the pastel. We can actually go one step further and add pastel to the Enchy Leopard Ivory to really enhance it even more. It's a pretty amazing combination. And essentially what pastel does is it really brings out a lot of the yellow. And a lot of times the pastel, probably to a lesser degree than the Enchy, it'll actually reduce the pattern just a little bit in some cases. Sometimes the pastel can really reduce the pattern in some cases. So here's what happens if you take the pastel and you work it into the Enchy Leopard Ivory. Take a look at this. It's pretty amazing. You actually just add pastel and you get this really crazy looking snake. And sometimes the patterns can be really unexpected as far as mixing all these together. I'm not sure exactly what's going on when you actually add all these genes together, but in most cases you really don't see the patterns of the genes. A lot of times you just see the colors, and then essentially what you have to do is you have to kind of look at some of the stuff that's been produced over here in Morphmarket and kind of compare it to the stuff that's been produced to see if you actually have these genes in your combination. So take a look at this. This is actually the fire. The fire is a pretty interesting gene. It's actually in the black-eyed leucistic complex. So if you take two fires and breed them together, you get an all-white snake with black eyes. And if you actually add Enchy to the super fire, it completely disappears and you won't see the leopard at all in the super fire. And the fire, usually when you mix it in with other combinations, it's actually a lightning gene. It kind of has a lightning effect on the color of the snake, which is pretty interesting. So here's what happens if you take fire and you work it into an ivory just by itself. Take a look at this. Essentially what you get is you get an ivory completely dominating the fire. It's almost impossible to even see that it's in there. Maybe you can tell that it's actually lightened it up and cleaned it up a little bit, but other than that you really can't tell that the fire is in there. And here's what happens if you take leopard and add it to this combination, the fire ivory. Take a look at this. This is pretty amazing what the leopard does. Essentially what it does is it brings out some of the fire, and in this case you can actually see it kind of changed the pattern a little bit. It's not really your typical leopard ivory. The fire really kind of jumbles up the pattern, and a lot of times it's kind of unexpected. You know, sometimes you just have to get kind of an experience with these combinations, working leopard into the ivory with other genes to figure out what's in there. So here is the butter. The butter is pretty interesting too. A lot of people think that the butter is the same as the lesser, or two different lines of the same gene. I actually did a comparison study of the butter versus the lesser, and come to find out, pretty much my conclusion from that video, I think they are two different genes, pretty close. You can actually make the super butter and the super lesser, which looks almost exactly the same. Although the butter seemed to be a little bit brighter on the bright end, and then the lesser seemed to be a little bit darker on the dark end, but you can get a lot of overlap. This one, as a matter of fact, when I first looked at this, I thought, wait a minute, that looks exactly like some of my lessers that I have here in my collection. And as a matter of fact, this one's actually a little bit brighter than some of my lessers. I think the butters can be just a little bit brighter in some cases. So here's what happens if you take butter and you work it into an ivory. Take a look at this. The ivory completely overwhelms the butter where you really can't see it in there. You can kind of see a trend with the ivory kind of dominating all these genes when you mix them in. But here's what happens if you take this combination and you work in the leopard. Take a look at this. This is kind of interesting. This is actually the leopard butter ivory, which is pretty interesting. You can see this line on the back really got really wide, and you see kind of surrounding this line, you see kind of this purplish line on either side. And the kind of the interesting thing about this combination is if you actually take leopard and work it into butter, or the leopard lesser, I'd say say probably 50% of the time when you're working those genes together with the leopard and the butter, you end up with a striped snake, which is kind of interesting. I actually brought one up over here without the ivory so you can kind of see what the genes look like without the influence of the ivory. Take a look at this. This is the butter and the leopard together, which is a really interesting combination. And the leopard is actually a dark gene, so you can see it's really darkening the background here, and then the combination of the two, it brings in this, it's almost like three stripes in some cases. It's kind of an interesting combination. And when you mix the butter and the leopard, it doesn't always make a striped snake. It seems like about half the time it's striped and half the time it's kind of jumbled up. But you can definitely see the influence of the butter leopard in the ivory when you work it in. And the leopard actually breaks it through the ivory. It's kind of interesting. So this is kind of the last one I want to show you. This is really interesting. This is the pied, and this is actually a recessive gene. And what the pied is, essentially what it does is it brings in these big patches of white on the snake. And sometimes you can get a high white pied, and sometimes you can get a low white. Then, you know, the amount of color versus the amount of white can be pretty random and unpredictable. Unless you work other genes in it, you can actually force the high white or the low white with certain genes when you're working with the pied. And here's what happens if you work pied into the ivory. Take a look at this. This is pretty interesting. If you actually take a look at this snake really close, you can actually see just a little bit of color right here kind of breaking through, and a little bit of color right here, and maybe a little bit more on the head. You can see little influences all over the snake from the effects of the pied, which is kind of interesting. It almost, you know, you actually can see some enchies kind of breaking through just a little bit like this. And here's what happens if you work leopard into the ivory pied. Take a look at this. This is kind of amazing. It actually brings out all the yellow color of the pied. And it's, let me tell you, when you're working with ivories, it can be really difficult working other genes into it. Sometimes they can completely disappear, but I think the key to kind of figuring out what genes are in there is to work in leopard, and then pretty much all the time you actually see some of the patterns and colors actually breaking through. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Ruben Martinez asks, what should I breed my snake to? He is a banana 66% het clown male. And that is a good question. A lot of people are wondering, hey, what should I breed my snake to? And if I actually had that snake, probably what I'd do is I would buy a clown female and breed it to it and prove out the 66% het clown. So there's a 66% chance that it has one copy of the clown gene, 1 out of 3 chance that it actually doesn't contain the clown. And if you actually just kind of ignore it and start breeding it through your collection, it can kind of catch up with you kind of later on, and you start scratching your head. I wonder if it's het clown. And if you actually prove it out later, a few years down the road, this has actually happened to me before, you actually find, you know, that it actually does contain 1 copy of the clown. Essentially, that changes all your offspring that you produced ever since you got that snake. So if you actually prove it to be 100% het clown, all the offspring would be 50%. And sometimes the het clowns can actually increase the value of the snake. And if you actually prove it out and it's not het clown, probably what I would do is I would take that banana and I would breed it to an enchi. One of my favorite combinations is the banana enchi. Pretty much worked into any other genes, makes some really amazing combinations. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.